monstrous Bruiser Brody was one of the most popular wrestlers in the 1970s and 80s, standing in at a massive 6'8" and a gargantuan 300 pounds. He was a force to be reckoned with all over the world. But on one fateful night before a show, a Puerto Rican wrestler named Invader 1 savagely murdered Bruiser Brody in cold blood with a knife. And the kicker in all of this is that Invader 1 never spent a single day in jail for the murder of Bruiser Brody and essentially got away with this disturbing murder. But how did it all get to this point? And how did a murder case so clear-cut and intentional get swept under the rug? This is the story of the murder of Bruiser Brody.
Police walked in and thinking, well, it's just another crazy, wild wrestling brawl. They didn't think it was real. A man died. What's going on here?
You don't see me crying. You don't see me down on my knees begging about it. I go in there and take care of business, and business for me and me only, and that's the way I want it to stay.
Bruiser Brody, real name Frank Goodish, was born in Detroit, Michigan in 1946, and from an early age he was always an excellent athlete. He was a standout football and basketball player at his high school in Michigan, and went on to become a football star in college at West Texas State University. Brody continued to play football professionally, spending 3 seasons in the Texas Football League and even was a member of the practice squad for Washington Redskins in the NFL from 1969 through 1971. While still trying to make it in the NFL, Brody also began training with the notorious Fritz von Erich to become a professional wrestler. He adopted the names King Kong Brody and his most famous moniker, Bruiser Brody, and began working as a freelancer throughout the various territories in the United States. With his football dreams over, Brody transitioned into becoming a full-time wrestler and began to find more and more success in the ring. Brody portrayed a crazed wild man and wrestled an unpredictable, hardcore style. He would swing a metal chain around during his entrances and sometimes even during his matches. He developed legendary rivalries against other hardcore wrestlers such as Kamala the Ugandan Giant, Crusher Jerry Blackwell, and his most popular nemesis, Abdullah the Butcher. Their encounters would resemble all-out brawls more than wrestling matches, and were typically bloody affairs that spent more time outside of the ring than in it. Brody also had short stints in Vince McMahon Sr.'s WWF and in New Japan Pro Wrestling. Brody saw his most success, however, in All Japan Pro Wrestling. There, Bruiser Brody collected numerous championship belts, including winning the NWA International Heavyweight Championship on 3 separate occasions, and was one of the promotion's most popular attractions. The Japanese fans were so enamored with Brody that Ric Flair has even said that Brody was making upwards of $25,000 a week with All Japan due to his demand. Brody was known, however, for holding somewhat a contentious relationship with various promoters. He was extremely protective over his persona, never letting his character slip in public, and oftentimes refused to lose in order to keep his character's air of invincibility. This would occasionally cause problems, especially when he was pitted against other wrestlers who were deeply protective over their characters. Brody also had many issues with promoters over his pay. He had a reputation throughout the wrestling world for being specific about his rate and his paychecks, which could occasionally manifest itself as an issue inside the ring. One of the most infamous of these instances was in Florida in 1987. Brody was set to take on Lex Luger in a steel cage match for the Florida State Championship. Midway through the match, Brody just stopped wrestling and began standing in the middle of the ring. Luger and the referee attempted to find out what was wrong, but Brody wouldn't answer. In a panic, Luger shoved the referee to force the match to end in a disqualification. Luger asked Brody afterwards if he did something to upset Brody, but was told no. There has been numerous theories to explain Brody's unusual actions. Some felt that he had been upset with Luger not selling his offense and making him look bad, but subsequent viewings of the match have shown that Luger was actually working with Brody and selling for him. Others have said that it was a miscommunication between the two as to who would lead the match, causing Brody to get upset. But the actual explanation was that Brody was in a dispute with the promoters over his paycheck and decided to embarrass them by ruining the main event match. Despite his reputation for being surly with promoters, Brody was also known as someone who could always be relied on to help out a promotion that needed a boost in ticket sales. This was just one of the many contradictions that made up Bruiser Brody. He was one of the few wrestlers in the era that was extremely adept at keeping his real-life personality and his wrestling character separate. Where his public persona of Bruiser Brody was loud and a wild brawler, His private persona of Frank Goodish was a soft-spoken, loving family man. After getting a divorce from his first wife after a year and a half, he met his second wife Barbara while doing a tour in Australia. The two were married in a small ceremony in Las Vegas and had their only son in 1980. Brody was said to have been deeply changed by the birth of his son, shifting his professional wrestling goals into making sure that his family was taken care of. One of those goals was to get an ownership piece of a professional wrestling promotion. Many of the top stars in the era transitioned into investing in territories because it was a consistent way to continue to make money in the industry, even long after their days in the ring were done. With Brody making the amount of money he was in Japan, he began to look into investing that money, and the territory that he had his eye on was the World Wrestling Council in Puerto Rico. The World Wrestling Council, WWC, was the top promotion on the island, and the territory itself was one of the most rough and tumble ones in the world. The fans in Puerto Rico were notoriously bloodthirsty. They were known for throwing batteries and bodily fluids at the wrestlers and responded the most to matches that featured a high degree of violence. Because of this, Brody had also found a good degree of popularity in Puerto Rico, seeing that his wrestling style fit right in. By the late 1980s, the World Wrestling Council was primarily owned by three men. The first was Gorilla Monsoon, the second was Victor Quinones, pardon my pronunciation, and the final was Carlos Colon, who is very significant in the story of Bruiser Brody. Colon was a legend in Puerto Rico. He was both the founder of WWC alongside fellow wrestler Victor Jovica, as well as the promotion's top star through the 80s and 90s, winning the heavyweight championship a staggering 26 times. The final key member of the management group in the World Wrestling Council was Jose Huertas Gonzalez, who wrestled under the name Invader 1 and was the right-hand man of Colon and served as the promotion's booker. Invader 1 also had a tumultuous history with Bruiser Brody. The two had met in the ring on multiple occasions, and they were almost always violent encounters. Brody had a habit of laying in stiff, sometimes unplanned, punches during matches with people he didn't particularly like, and Brody had been on record as saying that he didn't respect Invader 1, who he deemed to be cocky. This came to a head when the two faced off in Puerto Rico, and Brody absolutely embarrassed Invader 1 by no-selling his offense and barbarically beating him to a bloody pulp. Invader 1 was embarrassed by his demolition at the hands of Brody because he was in front of the Puerto Rican fans, and considering that Invader 1 was a massive star in his home place of Puerto Rico, it was a massive hit to his ego. The beating was so bad in fact that Invader 1 had to stay in the hospital for a few days, and in the hospital he was tamping, fuming and raging at Brody, so much so that he was quoted as saying, "I'm going to kill that man." Besides the harsh beating, there were also a few things behind the scenes that caused Invader 1 to be so mad at Brody. There were reports that the owners of WWC were in the midst of brokering a deal with Brody that would see them sell a few of their shares in the promotion to Brody. This would give Brody a minority share of the company, and many felt that with his newfound power, he may have tried to make a play to get rid of Invader 1. He intimated as much to fellow wrestler and friend Tony Atlas. Rumors of this spread to Invader 1, and he was irked by them. There were also reports that Brody had been owed a substantial amount of money by the WWC as well. Brody was owed anywhere between $20,000 and $25,000, and had told friends before going back to San Juan, Puerto Rico, that he was determined to get paid before he returned, and that he was willing to fight people if it meant getting his money. Little did Brody know that he would get into a fight, and that fight would be the last of his life. On 17 July 1988, Brody's last day on Earth and on the day of the show, Brody and fellow wrestler Dutch Mantel were waiting at their hotel for Invader 1 to come and pick them up to go to the arena. When Invader 1 never showed, Tony Atlas ended up picking the two up and they all traveled together. Upon getting to the arena, however, they saw that Invader 1 was already in the locker room. Invader 1 was sitting in a huddle with one of the owners of the WWC, Carlos Colon, and one of the founders, Jovica, but their deep conversation was halted upon the arrival of Brody, Mantel, and Atlas. Invader 1 then got up and left the locker room, walking directly past the three men without saying anything. Dutch Mantel began to feel an uneasy tension in the locker room. Between the odd huddle from the Puerto Rican management and Invader 1's behavior, he decided to leave the locker room to watch fans enter the arena. Brody had sat down to discuss the sketches that Atlas was working on in the locker room when Invader 1 returned. Invader 1 now had a towel wrapped around his hand and asked Brody to meet him in the showers to discuss business. This wasn't an incredibly unusual request, as Invader 1 was the booker, and it was typical for the booker to talk through the finish of a match with the talent away from the rest of the group. The layout of the locker room was set up so that no one in the locker room could see what was happening in the showers. Once Brody went back there, tragedy struck as the wrestlers heard a struggle and then 2 screams. Tony Atlas jumped up and rushed over to the shower, where he saw a bloodied Brody and Invader 1 holding a knife, preparing to swipe down again. Atlas pulled Brody out the way and claims that the knife was so sharp that it cut off Brody's ponytail when Invader came down with it. Cologne then jumped in to pull Invader 1 away from Brody and did what he could to prevent any of the other wrestlers from getting to Invader 1. The two retreated back into the showers and began to argue while Atlas brought Brody into the locker room and laid him down, promising to protect him from any more attacks. Brody had been penetrated by the knife in the body twice. His intestines were coming out of his sides and he was bleeding badly, both internally and externally. The doctor on site did what he could to help, but it was quickly determined that Brody would need far more serious medical attention. Invader 1 continued to argue within the shower, now with Victor Jovica. Invader 1 and Jovica's argument eventually ended and Invader 1 packed his bag and left the locker room area, walking right around the bleeding Brody. Hearing the commotion coming from the locker room, Dutch Mantel returned and was given the news that Invader 1 had stabbed Bruiser Brody. Chaos began to ensue as the wrestlers tried to get help for Brody. One of the owners of WWC, Quinones, was unable to get through to the hospital, so he resorted to calling a local radio station so that they could broadcast the wrestling event needed an ambulance urgently. An ambulance driver heard the call and began to make his way to the arena, but even that was a struggle. It took nearly an hour for the ambulance to finally get to Brody because of the heavy traffic outside the venue. The show was sold out and the fans were only just starting to get into the arena, so many of the roads leading to the arena were heavily congested. Cologne, meanwhile, had come out of the shower area and made his way towards Brody, but Atlas tried to keep Cologne away. Atlas was immediately suspicious of Cologne's involvement in the stabbing and was concerned that he may try to hurt Brody further, but since Brody was still alive, he insisted to allow Cologne to come close. Cologne asked Brody if he needed anything, and Brody only told him to take care of his family as he clutched a picture of his son. The brief conversation and request confirmed that Brody didn't think he was going to make it. When the paramedics finally did arrive on scene, they were unable to lift the 300-pounder onto a gurney and bring him to the ambulance. Tony Atlas, who was also a powerlifter, decided to help and even jumped into the ambulance to stay with Brody as they finally made their way towards the hospital. Though once they arrived at the medical facility, their problems didn't end. There were no doctors coming to work on the injured wrestler for an extended period of time. Frustrated, Atlas took it upon himself to find a doctor to come and take care of his friend. When he finally found a doctor, he asked why no one had come to see them yet, considering Brody had been stabbed and it was an emergency situation. He was told that in Puerto Rico, stabbings were as common as colds, so they weren't viewed with the same urgency as they would be on mainland USA. Nonetheless, the doctor still helped Brody, but when he removed Brody's shoes, he saw that his feet had already turned blue, and this prompted more doctors to jump into action to try and save Brody's life. After some time, Atlas was told that the doctors had stabilized Brody's condition, though they still had some concerns over Brody's liver being punctured. Meanwhile, the WWC show was continuing as scheduled, despite the potential murder that had taken place before it. The police had been called to the venue, but their initial investigation was continually misled. To start, the police were under the impression that the stabbing wasn't a real event, but was instead just part of an elaborate wrestling angle. The ins and outs of professional wrestling were still heavily guarded in Puerto Rico, with many of the angles and rivalries believed to be real by the people who weren't involved. Once it became apparent that this was an actual stabbing, however, the police were told by various Puerto Rican wrestlers that it was a crazed fan who stabbed Brody outside the locker room. When Atlas finally returned from the hospital, he was first annoyed to see all of the wrestlers laughing and enjoying themselves talking about the show when Brody had just been stabbed mere hours earlier. He then became enraged when he was asked by the police if he knew anything about the fan who stabbed Brody. Immediately, Atlas began yelling that it wasn't a fan who stabbed Brody, it was Invader 1. Atlas frantically tried to tell the police everything that he saw, but many of the police officers didn't speak English, so the accusations went nowhere. It was around this time that Invader 1 returned to the locker room to get ready for his match, now wearing a different shirt, free of the bloodstains. This agitated Atlas even more, and he continually tried to get some of the Puerto Rican wrestlers to translate for him to the police. However, time and time again, the wrestlers would look at Invader 1 and then walk away, refusing to help Atlas. In the end, there was never much that these officers would have done anyway, even if they did understand Atlas. Colón and Invader 1 were huge stars in Puerto Rico, and it was highly unlikely that two everyday police officers would take either man into custody. Atlas went out to wrestle his scheduled match with the Iron Sheik, but before he could return to the locker room, he came across Puerto Rican wrestler Savio Vega, who had Atlas's bag. He warned Atlas that Invader 1 and Colón were looking for him because they had heard that Atlas was talking, and recommended that Atlas leave the arena as soon as he could. Atlas took his bag and headed to the beach, where he would stay and sleep for the night. Mantell returned to the hotel and asked the front desk to forward any calls for Brody to his room, in case someone called looking for information. Colón had his wife call Brody's wife to inform her that an accident had taken place at the show. When Brody's wife tried calling the hotel, Mantell confirmed that Brody was seriously injured and recommended that her and her son come to San Juan, Puerto Rico immediately. In the morning, Mantell asked the front desk if they could call the hospital to get an update on Brody. It was then that Dutch Mantell learned that Bruiser Brody had passed away during the night. The doctors had brought him in for a second surgery during the night, and Brody bled out on the operating table. Mantell has stated that he believes that were Brody in an American hospital, he would still be alive today. Then, the wrestlers met in the lobby of the hotel, where they were given the news of Brody's passing and discussed what to do next. Many of them decided against continuing the tour in lieu of the tragedy, forcing the promotion to cancel a sold-out show that very night. Many of the Americans waited in Atlas's room for the police to eventually contact them for more information, but the calls never came. The WWC had been hiding the information of the whereabouts of the wrestlers to the police in order to try and squash the investigation. Atlas and Mantell eventually called the detectives themselves and were finally brought into the station to give their testimony. Atlas was informed that he was the only person so far who had given them the story that it was Invader 1 and not a fan who stabbed Brody. Mantell eventually corroborated Atlas's accounting of events, and both men were told that the investigation into the stabbing would continue. The Puerto Rican detectives had their own rivalry brewing with Carlos Colón because of his massive power within Puerto Rico. Because of this, the detectives were more than willing to go after his right-hand man, Invader 1, to show that Colón wasn't in control of everything that happened on the island. Atlas and Mantell were also told that there were plans to charge Invader 1 with first-degree murder, and that they would both be contacted in the event that this investigation led to a trial. Brody's wife and son arrived in San Juan that day and ran into Abdullah the butcher at the airport. Brody's wife frantically asked for an update on her husband, and Abdullah had to be the one to tell her the sad news that he was gone. She was then tasked with how to get the now deceased Brody's body off of the island and back to the States. She ended up deciding to host a small funeral in Puerto Rico, which was attended by the family, a few of the wrestlers, and some locals, and then she decided to cremate the body in order to bring it back with her to the United States. A few days after the incident took place, Invader 1 was arrested by the police for the murder of Bruiser Brody. Invader 1 didn't stay in custody for very long, however. That very same day, Invader 1 made the $120,000 bail and was able to walk free. But he wasn't entirely in the clear yet. The case was brought to trial, but it wasn't as easy for the prosecution to prove their case as they may have hoped. During the trial, Invader 1 did admit to stabbing Brody in the shower, but argued that he did so out of self-defense. Again, kayfabe was extremely prevalent in Puerto Rico, and Bruiser Brody had always been portrayed as a wild, crazy man in all of his public appearances. Because of this, in the eyes of the Puerto Rican people, and more importantly to the court, the maniac that portrayed Bruiser Brody was exactly how he was in real life. To the court, it seemed reasonable that an argument may have ensued between the two, and that Invader 1 may have feared for his life against the crazed Bruiser Brody. There were also two other major issues that the prosecution faced. First, the knife that was used to murder Bruiser Brody had mysteriously disappeared. To this day, the weapon has never been recovered and no one knows exactly what happened to it. Secondly, there was no one there to corroborate the story the prosecution was selling to point the finger at Invader 1. That was partially because there were no true eyewitnesses to the stabbings, but more so because neither Tony Atlas nor Dutch Mantel were present at the trial. Both men were given subpoenas to appear in court, but conveniently didn't actually receive those subpoenas until over a week after the trial had finished. Mantel has kept his subpoena and stated that though the subpoena was issued in a timely manner, it was postdated for 10 days after the trial. This likely meant that the subpoenas were purposely left on a desk for a week and a half to ensure that neither man would make it to the trial. There was definitely something fishy going on there. Carlos Colon, however, did manage to make it to court to testify in defense of Invader 1. In the end, Invader 1 was found neither guilty nor innocent, but was acquitted on the murder charges on the grounds of self-defense. So Jose Hurtas Gonzalez, Invader 1, got to walk free, and the Goodish family was never able to receive their justice. The court case, for all intents and purposes, was a sham, yet another one of the many ways the killing of Bruiser Brody was covered up. After Brody's demise, tributes from the wrestling world poured in, and Brody was commemorated as one of the best big men in wrestling history. Brody was also inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2019, but for as great as these tributes were to Brody's legacy in the ring, it was nowhere near as valuable as justice would have been for his untimely demise. Though Carlos Colon was never proved to have been part of the conspiracy to kill Bruiser Brody, many have questioned his involvement in the situation to this day. Colon never faced any legal or disciplinary action, and in fact went on to have a decorated career as a promoter that has seen him inducted into the Puerto Rican Sports Hall of Fame, and also the WWE Hall of Fame, a whole 5 years before the induction of Bruiser Brody. As for Invader 1, he never spent a single day in jail for stabbing Bruiser Brody. He was employed by Colon and the WWC for years after the incident, wrestled as recently as 2022, and still lives as a free man today in Puerto Rico. Ultimately, we will never know what the second act of Bruiser Brody's career may have looked like, or what changes he would have instituted into the WWC after taking part ownership of it. All that we do know is that he was cut down at only 42 years of age, and that those responsible for his death got away with murder. Invader 1 is one of wrestling's most notorious and infamous murderers. Another is Chris Benoit, who murdered himself, wife, and son in 2007. However, there's a multitude of conspiracy theories believing that Chris Benoit wasn't the one behind the murders, and in fact it was Kevin Sullivan. If you'd like to check the video on the Chris Benoit conspiracy theories, click the video on screen now. Thank you for watching the video.